Hi, this is Chris Smith with Local Joe's. At Local Joe's, we help local business. Hi, this is Chris Smith with Local Joe's.
This is City Pulse Newsmakers, a weekly look at the issues and the people behind them in Greater Lansing. Brought to you by City Pulse, Lansing's weekly alternative newspaper. And now, here's your host, City Pulse publisher, Burl Schwartz.
Good morning. Our topic today is democratic socialism. It's back on our political conversation thanks to the insurgent presidential candidacy of Bernie Sanders, who will be on the ballot in the Democratic primary here in Michigan on March 8th against Hillary Clinton. Our guest today to talk about that are former Congressman Mark Schauer. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Burl.
MSU economics professor Charles Ballard. Nice to have you here for the first time.
Thank you very much.
And City Pulse columnist Mickey Hurton. I'm looking forward to this discussion with Mickey because we've had it in my office. The professor, let's start with you. Tell us, if you will, what is democratic socialism?
Well, that's actually a tricky question because socialism is a word that different people apply in very different ways. And I think a lot of people of my generation who grew up in the Cold War with a conflict with the USSR, they hear socialism and it's a pretty scary word. I don't think that that's what Bernie Sanders has in mind, although it's clear that he has in mind a very activist government. An important part of it is the democratic part, because clearly when Lenin or Marx or Stalin said socialist, they didn't want to have elections that would get in the way. And Sanders does want to have democratic processes, and he's hoping that those processes can be pushed in ways that would be more beneficial to the bottom 99% of the income distribution than what we've had in the last generation or so.
All right, so some of the basic tenets of what he proposes are essentially not to raise taxes broadly, but to raise them on the rich. Is there enough money to actually do a $1 trillion infrastructure project or free college education?
To do a lot of the things that Senator Sanders is talking about, I think it is true that there's a lot of money at the top, but you'd almost certainly have to have some tax increases in middle and upper middle echelons of the income distribution, and not just in the very, very rich.
There are tax increases at virtually every income level, between the payroll tax and the increase in just general taxes. Every income level tax would increase to some extent. His position is, at the bottom, you would get more benefit than the tax increase that you pay. But I believe every income
But the net effect would be perhaps neutral for most people.
Many people,
for
perhaps,
many people,
based on his assumptions, and that's the issue.
Mark, you've done a lot of politics in your life. Selling a tax increase, how hard is that in this country?
Well, it's difficult not only in this country, but it's difficult within legislative bodies. I was a member of Congress for 2 very important years, first 2 years of President Obama's term. That's when we passed the Affordable Care Act, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, saved the auto industry. Actually, very germane to this conversation about Wall Street, we passed the Dodd-Frank Act. These things were very, very, very difficult to do. Now, I'm going to leave to the theorists, the definitional questions, and to Bernie Sanders to sort of define himself. He's identified himself as a democratic socialist. To me, the question of the ability for Bernie Sanders, should he become president, to get these things done really is the most relevant one to me. Now, in full disclosure, I've endorsed Hillary Clinton. I did back in 2008. We have very important work to do. I mean, it's interesting, Bernie Sanders' sort of language is similar to the theme of my campaign here for governor in 2014. It's creating an economy that works for everyone, not just the wealthy. So we need to make critical investments. We need to close the exploding income gap in this country. But it's one thing to wage a revolution and have who doesn't want free college, right? Or many other things. We have to be able to deliver on these, and the four former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors have really sort of shot down Senator Sanders' plans, at least his projected 5.3% economic growth rate as a result of these policies. So I'm not an economist. I'm sort of a recovering politician. But someone that cares very deeply. I have 5 grandchildren. I want the best schools in the world. I voted for the Affordable Care Act and maybe lost my job in Congress as a result of it. It was the right thing to do. I think where Hillary Clinton is trying to take us, and should she become president, I think she'd be an excellent president, is a more realistic approach to sort of covering the remaining 10% or so that aren't covered, whereas Bernie Sanders wants to sort of Medicare for all, single payer, and sort of relitigate what we went through in the 111th Congress to pass the Affordable Care Act. So I'm very interested in
it seems like she's more willing to work within the system. Bernie sort of wants to blow it up.
But hasn't President Obama been willing to work within the system, but the other part of the system says we're not going to work with you, and won't they feel the same way toward Hillary Clinton?
Well, I just mean she's looking to use some of the existing structure to fashion her programs, rather than Bernie says a single payer system changes the insurance, it changes private insurers, it changes everything. It changes payment to hospitals, payment to doctors, payments to everyone. And that's a pretty radical change. Whether it's politically feasible, I doubt, but it's much broader than probably a Clinton who's going to work in the system.
Go ahead, Professor.
Well, full disclosure, you're supporting Clinton. I haven't endorsed either of the two. But I think it's fair to say that Medicare for All is something that's been talked about for a long time, and it is certainly feasible economically. There's no question about that. It has to be, because that's what Canada, all of Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand have. All of the rest of the developed world have something sort of like that, with different details from country to country. Difficult in the United States politically, and especially difficult because of the political power of insurance companies. Sure. That's really the reason why I think when Barack Obama faced the choice of which direction to go, he thought that he had some chance of getting something like the Affordable Care Act passed, because that left the insurance companies, that didn't take them on.
Which was ironically very similar to prior Republican proposal. I think Bob Dole had essentially the same proposal.
No, it's Obamacare is Romneycare, except for 50 states instead of for Massachusetts. Ironic, of course.
Isn't this a gradualism question? If Sanders were elected, and of course he's a very long shot, and probably a very long shot to get the Democratic nomination, but isn't this really not about what he could do in 8 years, but more about the path he could set us on?
I think it is, and it's interesting, having been there during, the time when our economy had gone off the cliff, and a new president, a historic new president, and Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate leader at that time, minority leader, had said, we're going to, try to block everything that he proposed. It was a very difficult time. I mean, keep in mind, we had a Democratic majority in the House, a majority in the Senate. Then Ted Kennedy passed away, so we didn't have 60 votes, which is very important and procedurally to get things done. But President Obama has been criticized by some for taking a sort of a gradualist approach. But look at what has been accomplished. I mean, he has been accused, even sued over using executive orders for Dreamers and for various other issues, environmental, air quality regulation, and so forth. But that's the way things get done. Our government was not designed to be particularly efficient. If you read sort of the way the founding fathers created the three branches of government, it was, you talked about the old USSR earlier, quite an efficient model.
Yeah,
Until it wasn't.
Yeah, until it collapsed.
if you can execute millions who don't go along with your plans, that
when you
does smooth things
set aside
over.
government or
It
change
sounds
it.
like Donald Trump to me.
Well, regardless of who's elected, if it's a Democrat, it's likely to be either Sanders or Clinton. If it's a Republican, I guess it would be likely to be Trump, Cruz, or Rubio.
It looks like Donald Trump.
Any one of those people will face the difficult problem on January 21st of next year that they can't pass laws by themselves.
Absolutely.
There will be a Congress.
It
it's
is
likely to be a divided Congress as it is now.
It is a give and take process. And I want to all the viewers, all Bernie Sanders supporters, I love what Bernie Sanders has brought to the table. I mean, I think he has affected Hillary Clinton as a candidate. I think he's made her better. I mean, she was talking about many of these issues already, but maybe in not the same detail or with the same vigor or passion. So Bernie Sanders needs to be a very important part of the Democratic team going forward. But
Of course, he's not a Democrat, is he? Isn't that the issue?
He was not. His caucus with the Democrats in
Right.
the U.S. Senate, and now
Well, he may not be a Democrat, but
Demo-
would they like to do without his vote?
Well,
No, absolutely not.
no, but again, it tells you something about Sanders, doesn't it? And his inability to work, for me, within a political system.
But isn't the other side of that, Mickey, that the suspicion of Hillary Clinton is she's too willing, that she's too much in the pocket of the big interests, and that's why Sanders is caught on?
Well, I think Sanders is caught on because he promises a free lunch.
Well, he's not promising a free lunch. He's saying he wants Wall Street to pay a fraction of a percent for a $1 trillion infrastructure program, and the education program to $75 billion a year. Is that really in our budget that ridiculous?
Well,
considering the benefit from it?
To me, it seems like a free lunch program where everybody's going to benefit, and he's just going to soak the rich. And I don't believe. I'm not seeing economists, as I've researched for this, who are going, pretty solid plan, Bernie. I'm just not seeing it. It's whether, as you point out, the economic advisors, or it's Thorpe, that economist from Emory who's looked at his healthcare plans. I'm just not seeing a lot of people going, looks good to me.
Well, I think there's an important distinction to be drawn. An economist at the University of Massachusetts has done an analysis of some of Sanders' plans and said that would lead to a growth rate of more than 5%, which we haven't had in the United States in decades.
It's about 2.1 on average, isn't it?
Over recent decades, 2% or so is where we have typically been. 5% would be a huge improvement. And then a lot of notable economists, Laura Tyson, Alan Kruger, Paul Krugman, Austin Goolsbee, and Christina Romer, all have said this is overblown. That doesn't mean that some of the things that are in the program are bad.
Right.
What if a more realistic thing that, hey, we hope we could get 2.5% or 3% growth? What Sanders is saying, one of the things is we should spend a lot to improve our infrastructure.
I think the goals are spot on, and I think when you look at this is fascinating. I've watched a lot of the debates. You watch. Martin O'Malley, I think, brought a lot to the table, as well as a successful Democratic governor.
And
but
never caught on.
Never. There was no oxygen in the room, right? But you look at Hillary and Bernie, and their priorities are essentially the same. It's a matter of approach, how to get there. Now, Bernie is 90% of the time is talking about economic inequality and Wall Street. I think Hillary sort of has a broader plan to go at a number of inequities and disparities in our society. In my view, again, no knock on Bernie Sanders, I think Hillary's plans are more detailed, really have broader support from economists in the respective fields. But I think you make a very good point, Professor, that he's got the right set of priorities. I mean, I don't think you'll find a bigger proponent of spending on infrastructure, especially what's happening in Flint, Michigan right now, or education, college affordability. Getting the remaining 10% or so who are uninsured insured in our country. These are all things that I do believe drive economic growth. I'm going to tend to fall on the side of the past four chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors that 5.3% is not realistic, but the aim is correct. That's why I feel that this is going to be a successful year for Democrats.
One of the things that strikes me is back in the 1930s, we had the happy warrior, FDR, but there is, I think, a legitimate argument that were it not for World War II, the economy wasn't really improving that quickly. But what he brought to the table was he was the happy warrior. And who can fill that role better, Bernie Sanders or Hillary
Well, he
Clinton?
brought a lot of programs, too.
He did bring
rural electrification,
right.
farm aid. I mean, it's more than just a spokesman.
Social Security.
But the question
But
is,
it's also
were they
true.
working at the time?
Right.
It's also true that FDR brought this boundless sense of optimism that really changed the atmosphere in a country that was falling apart at the time when he came to office. And at the time when he came to office, his ideas about exactly what to do were pretty vague. He had this notion of, we're going to experiment as we go along, we'll see what works, we'll see what doesn't. And for the first 4 years of his time in office, almost all the experiments worked. And then they said, okay, well, maybe we should retrench, and we got another mini depression in 1937 and 38.
Yeah.
And then the war finally obliterated the recession and shifted the economy into overdrive. But I don't think it's possible to overstate the importance of FDR's optimism, the way that he captured the hearts and minds of people, and that's hard to quantify economically, but it was important.
Yeah. And I was struck by a quote from Douglas Brinkley, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who's writing a book right now about FDR. Sanders is reminding people that he's part of not only an important political tradition in American history, but a winning one. Remember, FDR won 4 times as essentially a democratic socialist. I interrupted.
No, I don't know what to do with that. I was going to make a comment about, I watched Hillary Clinton's victory speech. Finally was able to give a real victory speech after the Nevada caucuses. Tonally, I think she's making some important shifts. Less about her biography, perhaps, more about bringing the country together in an aspirational way. So I've never met Bernie Sanders personally. I've heard him speak in person. I've met Hillary a number of times.
I've met him plenty of times.
You have?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Mickey was the managing editor of the executive editor of the newspaper in Burlington.
Oh, so you and
So he would come to meetings. He'd come in. He's the only representative, so it's harder to be a rep in Vermont than it is a senator. You got plenty of senators, only one rep.
Right.
And he would come in, and he was pretty sour and pretty much a scold. He was sort of the same. It was we used to sit there and say, can you imagine Bernie telling a joke?
Yeah.
And you couldn't.
But he has clearly changed.
He always changed. Well, he's gone Hollywood.
Right. He's very aspirational. But, Hillary, I know that she is in public service and is running for president because of her passion for service and passion for making things better for people and for communities in our country and making our country safer. and our world safer. So I think what I look for is for her to speak in a more inclusive, aspirational way. Some might accuse her of co-opting Bernie Sanders' message on economic equality.
It's just an homage.
But
that's all.
it's much more than that. And I think, this is an important conversation because I think, again, I think back about my gubernatorial campaign and with my opponent, the current governor, had given big tax cuts to corporations, folks at the top, raised taxes on struggling families, parents raising kids, retirees with a new pension tax cut, funding to education. I mean, widening
eliminate
inequality.
state jobs to privatize it for companies
Grand Rapids
like
Veterans Home,
Aramark,
and so forth. So seeing the gap being widened, and so I think the reason I'm optimistic about the Democratic Party and with Bernie Sanders part of the Democratic Party, we're talking about issues that really matter to people. Why did he catch on? Why? I may regret saying this, why is Donald Trump catching on? Because they're really connecting, in my view, of people who have been squeezed in this economy.
And people who feel that government isn't working. I mean, they just don't.
And stalemate in Washington feeds into that, which I think the Republicans like.
One of the economic statistics that I think is most important to point out, compared to the early 70s, the U.S. economy is 3 times as big as it was when I was in college in the early 70s. The average guy who works full-time year-round earns less now than, if you adjust for inflation, than the average guy who worked full-time year-round back in the early 70s. Well, that's an astonishing breakdown of a rapidly growing economy, but not really benefiting a whole lot of people. And so I think Donald Trump has tapped into that discontent, and Bernie Sanders has tapped into that discontent. It's interesting, of course, that Trump's tax plan would cut taxes on high-income folks and on businesses, very similar to Ted Cruz's tax plan. Cruz's, if you could sort of summarize his economic policies, it's we're not unequal enough. We need to do a little bit more for the rich folks. So we really do have a very distinct difference of opinion.
And either side says, no matter if we do ours, it's going to get better. I mean, for both ends.
Professor, we know about trickle-down economics. What do we know about what Bernie Sanders wants to do? He says that this will raise the middle class and that will greatly improve the economy. Is what he's talking about really going to raise the middle class?
More than Ted Cruz's policies, I think that's fair to say. If you look at the sources of the inequality, they're all sort of a reversal of the trends that we had in the 30s and 40s, getting back to Franklin Roosevelt. We've had weaker labor unions. We've had a minimum wage that didn't keep up. We're losing the race between technology and education. We've slowed down our investments in education. Sanders, in one way or another, is addressing quite a number of those. We have a much less progressive tax system than we did a generation ago. Now, I think it's fair to say that Hillary Clinton is also addressing many of those things. Sanders typically would go further. I look at the $15 minimum wage. I'm actually a little uncomfortable going that far. I think the U.S. could pretty easily go to 10, 11, 12, but the farther we go, the more chance there is for dislocation in the economy.
Would you say, though, that we've had a structural change in the economy? Because I'm thinking back to the 70s, we had a very vibrant manufacturing base. And I just think about the companies I covered, even the automotive industry. I mean, now they produce their cars with a fourth of the people. And throughout the entire world economy, manufacturing, which provided those middle jobs, is disappearing. It's becoming automated, and there's nothing to really fill that in.
That's right. That's really the one of all of these sources of income inequality. That's the one that is sort of impersonal economic force. The march of technology has been so fast. I mean, 50 years ago, there were people whose job in a factory was to fasten the same 4 bolts 107 times an hour.
Right.
Now those jobs are all
Well,
gone.
let's bring it back to some of these policy proposals. I mean, I like the contrast between what Hillary and Bernie are saying versus Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. I don't think, in all the debates I've watched, I don't think I've heard the word education more than once or twice, where our candidates are talking about reducing the cost of higher education, making it more affordable, supporting our schools. I mean, in this transitioned economy, we've got to make sure that our young people and our adults we're retraining have the skills in a newer high-tech economy. But, as you've noted, Burl, a couple of times about proposed investments in infrastructure, those are jobs that cannot be outsourced. And again, I'll mention Flint again. You look at the disinvestment in our core communities in particular, but in our communities in whole, and I look at the conditions of my roads, and I can't see what's below the ground. I mean, it is the best jobs program there is, and it will take leadership based on a set of priorities, someone that can actually, work with the Congress in the give and take, and to get it done. But I'm, this election, I think ultimately, and who knows what kind of October surprise there might be, or international incident or something, and what have you, security threat or risk, but it is going to be about jobs for people.
I want to talk a little bit about politics
Yeah.
before we go. We have just a minute and a half. Congressman, the big question I would think on Democrats' minds is, will they get out and vote regardless of whether it's Sanders or Clinton? We're seeing this erosion of support among women for Hillary Clinton. Sanders obviously is going to have big baggage among people who think socialism is communism.
Yeah.
What's going to happen?
Yeah.
Is she going to bring people out?
Well, I think so. I mean, look, Democrats vote more reliably in presidential years than midterm years. What I hope and expect in this fall is Hillary and Bernie coming together, having a unified Democratic Party, just like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton did, and unifying our party. And, I could mention 2 words that might remind people how important this is: Supreme Court. So when we're talking to young women and about their reproductive rights, who can you count on? And that's just one example. Who can you count on to be there to make the right kind of appointments and decisions to protect the things they care about? So at the end of the day, I'm not worried about it, but it's going to take some work.
And she did do better with women in Nevada than they had expected.
All right, you get the last word because
Well, there you
we're
go.
about out of time. I want to thank all our guests, former Congressman Mark Schauer, MSU economics professor Charles Ballard, and Mickey Hurton, City Pulse columnist and associate publisher. Thanks so much for tuning in. Have a great weekend.